Chapter 26. Baxter dug his hands further into his pockets and drew his coat around him. It wasn't the biting wind stinging his eyes or the drop in temperature that was barely pushing the mercury above freezing. He was chilled to the bone by the prospect of meeting Father Humendier. He had no real reason to be apprehensive, other than that Lockshire had dropped dead, and Humendier was the last person to have visited him. Baxter wasn't so naive as to postulate that Father Humendier wasn't in some way connected to Lockshire's death. As he was expected at 10:30 that morning, he picked up the pace. He'd left a valuable resource behind, Pilgrim. He hadn't been entirely honest with her when she'd asked where he was going. A look had passed between himself and Dashwood, leading Dashwood to divert her attention, and, because she was still on the mend, thankfully she hadn't picked up on it. He wasn't even sure what he was going to say, but he figured it would come to him once he'd arrived at Humendier's house. Father Humendier, according to the intel Frank had provided, was a scholar, a man of letters, and a bibliophile, with a particular penchant for brass rubbings. Now that had rung a bell. Baxter stood outside the heavily painted black gates, turned the large ring and lifted the latch. Reaching the front door, he pulled the iron bell, hearing its faint ring from somewhere inside. He waited, to the sounds of silence. Just when he thought Humendier must have forgotten their appointment, he leaned forward, picking up the faint shuffle from a pair of slippers. As the sound came nearer, he finally heard 3 bolts slide back after several oaths had been sworn. The door opened to reveal a wizened man in his late 70s. Father Humendier adjusted his bifocal pince-nez and peered at him through the lower lenses. "Mr. Baxter, how nice of you to pay me a visit. Please, won't you come in?" Father Humendier wore a heavily woven dressing gown reaching his ankles, with a silk cravat. On his feet were monogrammed slippers. His countenance was open, and his eyes shone out from under bushy grey eyebrows. Baxter stepped inside and took in the museum-like interior. It was apparent a duster hadn't been flicked about for many years, evidenced by the swathes of cobwebs trailed along the walls. "Please come through." He beckoned Baxter to follow him into the front reception room. "It's the only one with a fire. This house is now too large, and I'm the last of my order." As they made themselves comfortable, Father Humendier observed him before asking, "You mentioned in your letter that you would like to talk to me in regards to Mr. Lockshire." "Yes, you may have heard, and I apologise if I'm the bearer of bad news, but Mr. Lockshire is dead." He watched for his reaction. Father Humendier lifted a cross from under his robe and kissed it, whispering a few words in Latin. "I'm sorry to hear of his passing. He wasn't a young man, but still, God rest his soul. The thing is, Mr. Lockshire was working on something that I believe may have some bearing on his death." Father Humendier looked momentarily shocked, which was enough to convince Baxter the vote was still out on whether he knew anything about Lockshire's death. "Are you suggesting he didn't die of natural causes?" "I'm afraid that's not my province. Father Humendier, would you tell me why you visited Mr. Lockshire's chambers?" "To begin with, I should inform you I am the very Reverend Archimandrite of the Theological Letters, and not a father, per se. I hold the position of under-bishop, if you will. I have no objection to you addressing me as Father Humendier for the sake of our short interview." "Thank you," Baxter said. "Mr. Lockshire had a question in regards to a piece of land located in Devon called Dumpton. His query was in relation to any historical precedents there might have been between the Crown and the Church. With Baxter listening intently, he continued, "This is, of course, outside my normal sphere of interest. However, Dumpton has long been associated with moments of interest to the Church. The period of contention was, of course, when King Henry VIII ordered the dissolution of the monasteries. Mr. Lockshire was keen to verify the ownership of the land." "There was a monastery on Dumpton?" Baxter asked, surprised. Father Humendier shook his head. "I was unable to find any evidence of a monastery. However, there is historical evidence to support Dumpton was a place of worship. It was considered a sacred place, a place of, if I may use the euphemism, a place of evolution." "Evolution?" Baxter queried. "There are ancient accounts, folklore, as nothing can be based in fact, that people who had spent some time there came back, converted. There is also proof to support it once was the site of a henge." "Converted? In what way converted?" Baxter asked, confused. "I'm unable to answer that fully. The only information pertaining to it is based in pictorial form, much like Egyptian hieroglyphs, only with considerably less to go on, a couple of lines to be exact. The etching shows a figure is depicted standing outside the henge, whilst another inside clearly shows a circle just above their head." Baxter wasn't sure what to make of it. He asked, "You mentioned a henge. Do you mean like Stonehenge?" "Yes." Father Humendier stood up. Walking over to his bookcase, he began rummaging through a stack of files. Finally pulling one out, he returned to his chair. Leafing through various sheets, he stopped at one and handed it to Baxter. "Here, this explains it better." The thick sheet of paper showed an etching, probably originally taken from an old wood carving, titled Dumdon. It depicted an abruptly tall hill set within a basined landscape. At its top stood a cluster of trees, standing before a long plateau, on which was clearly depicted a group of giant stones, with a series of larger stones sitting atop. Baxter wasn't sure what to make of it. Sitting back down, Father Humendier pointed out, "One can't be certain it looked like that, although I understand there are pronounced dips within the surface of the plateau to suggest that at one point there was something large and heavy enough to account for such indentations, but, of course, it may have just been trees." "Or it might have been these stones," Baxter added. "These stars are quite deliberate. What does all this say?" he asked, pointing to iconography beneath. "I've deduced it's a warning of sorts. It shows a beacon and includes a reference to a constellation. The plaque should really be in a museum. It's been dated from a time when before stars were given names we're all now familiar with. We're talking of a time before the pyramids were built, and of course those astronomical points of reference have changed very little over millennia." Father Humendier stood up. "I'm going to have a cup of tea. Can I interest you in either coffee or tea?" "Tea would be most welcome, thank you." As Humendier shuffled out of the room, Baxter decided to follow him and continue their conversation. Once in the kitchen, where an old Aga warmed the room, Humendier continued, "It is a most curious and absorbing conundrum. Interestingly, the constellation that shone so brightly over Dumpton 5,000 years ago, as depicted on the wood carving, is shown as 3 points, a triangle, with a larger, brighter star at its centre. However, although those 3 stars can still be seen today, the centre star is missing." "Then it's an interpretation at best," Baxter said. "I believe the carving
was a literal record without embellishment.
Then how do you explain the missing star? Baxter asked.
I can't, other than assuming the obvious, that it manifests when a being stands within the centre of the stones. You'll recall my mentioning the beacon.
By definition, beacons are used to alert or warn.
They are also used as a signal and a guide.
Well, what does that mean? Baxter asked.
Oh, it's not a secret that significant terrestrial events are sometimes heralded by celestial alignments.
Baxter thought out loud. I wonder what became of the stones.
Oh, scattered to the four corners of the earth for all we know.
Humendier lifted the tin kettle from the solid top and poured the scalding water into a warm teapot and began to stir the tea.
In all likelihood, the stones were used by the locals for building. Once their original purpose had been lost in time, they wouldn't have understood their significance.
So there are none of the original stones remaining at the top of Dumpton?
Not that I'm aware of. It's likely the supporting stones were sarsen stones, and the ones balanced on their tops were logan stones.
What's the difference? Baxter asked, accepting his cup and saucer. Returning to the living room and sitting down, Father Humendier picked up the paper showing the wood carving. Pointing to the stones at the top and lifting a magnifier for Baxter to take a closer look, he said,
You'll notice the larger stones are depicted as giving off some sort of emanation. The figure outside the stones doesn't have a halo, for want of a better word, whilst the figure in the centre does, receiving some sort of enlightenment, perhaps.
When did halos first appear in art? Baxter asked.
I believe you're looking at it. The logan stones are shown as moving, which in essence is the purpose of a logan stone.
But this is all based in myth.
No, not at all. Logan stones can be seen today, particularly in Devonshire, although they're cordoned off for obvious reasons. These are stones that can weigh in excess of a ton, and are balanced on top of another, denser stone so they can be moved, and in some cases with just one finger. They can be turned or tilted. Sarsen stones were highly prized. They're generally formed of rarer indigenous rock, often with primary and secondary veins of another stone, alloy, or element.
Were you able to verify who owned the land? Baxter asked.
As far as I can tell, the land came under the Crown in the mid-1100s and has remained so ever since. Prior to that, it was claimed by the people for the people. As far as Mr. Lockshire's interest was concerned, it was purely for acquisition.
Baxter was finding he now had more questions than answers. He should be getting back to La Amethyst and run it all by Pilgrim. Placing his teacup down, he smiled at Father Humendier, extending his hand. Thank you very much for your time, but I must be going. Father Humendier stood and smiled.
Not at all, not at all. Let me show you the door.
As Baxter followed, he slowed, pausing as he began to notice several brass rubbings depicting various chainmail-clad knights behind dusty glass and antiquated frames. His eyes alighted on a barren square of wallpaper which stood out as having once had a frame in its place. Are these all your own brass rubbings? Baxter asked.
What's that? All my own brass rubbings? Oh, yes, indeed, since I was a boy.
He lifted his chin to a good example, muttered, and brushed the dust from its front using the sleeve of his robe.
This was one of my first, taken from the tomb of Sir Harold of Tackenbraun at All Saints' Abbey in Cumbria. All of these were taken in the days of freedom, when all a fellow had to do was to turn up with his astral heel ball and a roll of parchment. Times have changed. Do you know, in some places they even charge for the privilege, Daenios caprium redundos, and a diabolical liberty at that.
he finished, shaking his head. It looks as if one of them has gone astray. Baxter placed his hand on the empty wall space.
Not quite. I gave it to Mr. Lockshire after he showed an uncommonly deep interest in it.
Baxter's heart rate raced, and he was forced to take a deep breath, anticipating what was to come. Mr. Lockshire visited you here? Baxter prompted.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Lockshire was keen to visit me in my home. He claimed his chambers could be quite stifling at times.
Could you tell me what the brass rubbing was of?
Of course. As you can see, it had spent many decades on that wall. I took the rubbing during my first year as a priest when I was posted at Goethe, in Italy. It was rumoured to have come from a plaque that adorned a barrel of cognac from Napoleon. The carving was particularly fine.
Where was this plaque located in Goethe? Baxter asked anxiously.
Well, bless my soul, Mr. Baxter, if Mr. Lockshire didn't ask the very same question.
Really? Baxter said affectedly.
The plaque was one of several artifacts kept by the then priest of the local church. Now, what was his name? Father Romero.
Do you remember specifically which church? Baxter asked. Finding Baxter's underlying earnestness and over-inquisitiveness somewhat disconcerting, Humendier replied,
It was a small Catholic church, which had been used purely by the locals as it was out of the way. Goethe has only recently become a busy town. Originally, it had been predominantly a small military port.
Thank you, Father Humendier. You've been very helpful. Thank you again for your time. Baxter hurriedly said his goodbyes. As soon as he reached the main street, he hailed a taxi. La Amethyst, he instructed.